program. This is still a new day. Don't forget to go over to our social media platforms to like, comment, and share. Well, on an interesting note, we have someone here in the studio. His name is Nze Keazor. He is also Ezenia Ugonabo. Yesterday, he had an interesting lecture where he spoke about collective responsibility for the research and retelling of Igbo histories. And if you have been with us, you've probably heard me say that one of my personal pains is seeing that history has been taken out of schools, and any agenda to bring history back in schools and in our homes will be supporting that. So he's going to be talking to us about Igbo nation in search of cohesion in leadership. And someone said everything rises and falls on leadership. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So tell us, yesterday you had a lecture at Center for Memories. I, for one, was supposed to be there, but for some reasons. Tell us, how did it go?
The feedback I got was that it went down well. It provided food for thought, because obviously I can't say
you can't evaluate it by yourself.
I can't evaluate it on myself. Just the feedback I got is that people appreciated the points made. A 30-minute lecture will never give you the full vista to espouse on all the points, but at least it was the start of a conversation.
Absolutely.
And I'm grateful for the opportunity to probably expand on some of the things that I had started out talking about yesterday.
Okay, absolutely. Now let's talk about the Igbo nation and leadership.
Yes.
From a very historic point of view. Some people will say they don't make the Igbos like they used to, given the antecedents of our founding fathers. Where exactly did we start getting it wrong as a people, not just as a tribe, but also as a nation? At what point, what was the paradigm shift that, got us to where we are, which is why we have this huge gap that we're trying to fill? Okay.
That's a very broad question, but I'll attempt to answer it as briefly as possible. If we look through the historical epochs, right, at the time that the Igbo as a monolithic group began to formally coalesce, because there was never really it wasn't like we were never an empire, like you talk about the Benin Empire where there was a central authority. That was never the case in Igbo land. Igbos were, the Igbo nation, as it were, for want of a better description, consisted of hundreds of separate communities developing on their own or indeed in interrelationships with each other, but then there were two major cultures, right? Two major cultures that, should I say, provided governance across the broad swathe three major cultures, in fact, that provided governance across the broad swathe of the Igbo nation, as it were. One being the Nri culture. I'm not going to go into too much detail. The Nri culture consisted
but we know
of
they say
the titles.
Yes.
Yeah, the Nze titles were Nri motifs. Even the market days came from the Nri culture. That's the four Igbo market days. And then the other being the Aro culture.
Aro culture.
Yes, and the Aro culture is a bit younger than the Nri culture, but it had a great deal of influence in central Igbo land and also closer to the Cross River Basin, which is where the Aro Chukwu
migrated from.
Was actually where it was formed, and it was an amalgamation of several groups. There was a dominant Igbo culture as well as Ibibio, Ejegam cultures, which are more you can find more in the Akwa Ibom and Cross River states. But the Aro culture had a very strong influence on other parts of Central Igbo land. Now, the third influence would be that of the Western Igbo cultures, because the kingships of the present-day Delta states, Igbo-speaking Delta state communities such as Asaba, Onitsha, and so on and so forth, where they had monarchies, due to the influence of the Ezechime influence. So you find that there were three monolithic cultural influences. Now, did they interact? Obviously, they did. There was a very complex system of interaction where it's almost like, when you lend somebody your shoe or you lend somebody your shirt, and they say, look, when you finish, pass it on to the next person. There was almost like, these cultures were being passed on a very functional basis because people consider, okay, look, does this culture work for us? Does it enhance our lives? Adopt it. And it was adopted in a very complex, intelligent way. Now, if you look at the Nri culture, for one, the Nri were more of a theocracy. But then, beyond just being a theocracy, the Inri also had a lot of influence over agriculture. It was said that the Inri priests would travel round. There were itinerant priests who would travel round, and sanctifying when the planting season could start. People thought it was magic or juju or whatever. But you see, the reality is that what the Inri culture was simply practicing was knowledge, scientific knowledge. They could calculate planting cycles. They had the ability. It was simple mathematics.
And most of these guys were actually stargazers.
Isaac, who knew both times and season.
No, it's actually they stargaze and then they watch the season and then they deduce.
Absolutely.
So it's scientific.
It is pure science. And, it was based on pure science and also humane living, because some of the when people talk about the Osu caste system, the Osu was within the hegemonic system of knowledge, and it wasn't necessarily a negative thing. Although over time, the outcast motif, the outcast description became quite bold. At the time, it was said that when somebody had committed Nsoani, or had committed a crime against the land, be it a very, very serious crime, rather because we never believed in the taking of human life. In culture, abhorred the taking of human life. So you would have. There will be a cut on your ear, and when the blood drips to the ground and you are placed outside, that is almost like ostracization. And it's unfortunately it transmitted, kind of like through your genealogy. You know what I mean? So that was one of the in practice, because what really the whole point of Inri culture was humane living. Dwarfs who came within Inri were taken in and kept safe.
Did you say dwarfs?
Yes, like persons of physically challenged persons of a low height. It's a long description, but they were called dwarfs.
Yes.
Anyway, so they were taken into the palace of the Ezenri and given protection. And in fact, he bestowed upon them what he called mystical powers. In fact, at the time, there was during the reign of Ezenri Tabansi, in Region 4, Tabansi Udene, it was said that there was actually one of the female a dwarf who was his advisor, spiritual advisor, and they were said to have spiritual powers. Now, what at least one scholar has said is that this was purely more a case of ascribing mystical powers to them to provide them with protection from being brutalized by a wider society. So Inri was about humane living. Now, Aro was more about mercantilism.
What does that mean in plain English?
Aro, let me say, the Aro were the perfect capitalists.
Oh.
They were the perfect capitalists. You see, the thing, you get a lot of these stereotypes about Igbo. Oh, Igbo like Lego. The reality is that that's not quite correct. You see, and that's one of the reasons, one of the things I'm going to deal with shortly afterwards, is that the Aro people were, they were natural entrepreneurs. It wasn't always nice, because let's be honest, the Aro's place in the slave trade is well known, and it's not something that anybody should, But in fact, it got to a point that the Aro and Inri once had the only time Inri actually engaged in warfare, because warfare was against the philosophy, precisely the philosophy of the Inri people. The only time they engaged in warfare was was when the Inri formed a confederation, a confederal army to fight against the Aro. Now, you consider the Aro did not have an army. Aros were not known to be warriors.
But they were also known to be mercenaries.
No. What the Aro did was they hired mercenaries to fight for them.
Oh, yeah.
Now, what they hired the Abam and Eda, who by their nature were natural warriors. They loved fighting. And you see, people often say, that they were headhunters. No. You see, the thing is that headhunting at the time, so about 300-400 years ago, was a mark of manhood. So they needed to go through manhood rights. Now, so what Aro did will provide them with wars where they can go and fight and gain heads. So the Aro weren't necessarily doing it just for the money. It was more for the opportunity to fight, to be engaged in warfare. So this is and then of course the monarchies of the Umezechime and Oguta, because Oguta also had a monarchy, right? So where am I going with all this? This is the first phase of when we actually coalesced into a larger, we've never been a monolithic group, but we've been bound by at least two things. One, language. The binding factor was language, and also the market days, right? And the agricultural cycles. We were bound by these, and that really is what two of the early motifs of the Igbo nation, as it were. Now, the second phase was the colonial era, because obviously, as we know, from the late 19th century, the colonial incursion started. You know, the so-called Royal Niger Company treaties, which were signed by several Igbo communities who believed they were signing trading partnerships. They didn't know they were signing away their their lives. And then obviously the Niger Coast, well, the Oil Rivers and Niger Coast Protectorate treaties, which were converted into the protectorates, or basically converted into protectorate of southern and northern, well, the rest of Nigeria. For speaking generally about the rest of Nigeria, the protectorates of southern and northern Nigeria, which the Igbo communities were part of the southern protectorate.
Yes, protectorate.
Now, it is instructive that up until the protectorates were founded in 1900.
Okay.
But then there were wars of resistance being fought in Igbo land up until 1919. What does that tell you? That, okay, you say that we're now part of the Queen's country. When did we when did we agree to that? So people naturally fought. I mean, Obosi, my community, had been at warfare, a resistance to the Royal Niger Company in the late 19th century, of which my great-grandfather, Keazor,
Wow.
was an active warrior, you know, and then even up until 1901, 1902, because the Arrow invasion was 1902, up until 1903, when the Arrow eventually were conquered. There were still incursions led by Major Trenchard, you know, who Trenchard Hall Ibadan, you might have heard of. Yes, Major Trenchard, and who, in fact, the Ndiobose had a nickname for him. We called him Wangwele because he was a very slim, very slim man, but you know, well, he was doing the work of his masters. You know, Major Morehouse. Morehouse Road in Enugu.
Yes,
was
yes,
one of
yes,
indeed, Montanaro and so on and so forth. They were at the forefront of the decimation of resistance.
All right, let me ask this question.
Yes.
Sorry, if I caught your train of thoughts. Now, you have mentioned a lot of things about Igbos and how they came together, you know, bound by their language and the four market days. And I'm sure, of course, probably a judiciary system that was working for them and so many other things that we may not have mentioned. At what point did we get it wrong? Was it because of the colonial incursion, invasion? Was that the paradigm shift that, you know, got everybody running, you know, helter-skelter, and now we need to form an agency or a platform to bring about cohesion? Okay,
let me, because thank you for steering me back to the question. Now, the second phase, which was actually saw the most powerful cohesion of the Igbo nations, because there were the various nations, was in the colonial era. You know, when the Ekumeku resistance in the Western Igbo land finally ended at the end of the First World War in 1918, you know, and then the Igbo land was pacified, as they say. You know, eventually we began to accede to the new
culture,
power, to the new power base, because the colonials were now the new power structure, you know, the new power brokers. So we began to accede. Initially, there was resistance, but slowly, as the Anglican, as the missions...
We're talking religion now.
Well, the religion...
Governance, religion.
There's very little distinction. Because...
Two sides of the same coin.
There were two sides of the same coin. The fact is that the missions were in partnership with the governmental authorities, even though they had distinct remits and sometimes distinct objectives. But they were very much part of the same infrastructure. The missions relied on the colonial authorities, colonial government, for their legitimacy and their protection. So naturally, they were partners. In any case, they were the same color. You know. Now, when we saw that we had now been conquered, what did we do? We looked at the power shift. They had introduced warrant chief systems. So and these warrant chiefs suddenly had power that was backed by Maxim guns. So what did we do? We said, okay, let's adjust. Community started adjusting. There was some resistance, like at the about women's war. But then we started going to school. Whereas the West, people like in the Western Nigeria, places like Lagos and Ibadan, which had earlier contact with the colonials, and earlier alliances with the colonials. We, had a head start in terms of Western education. But then we began to catch up. We began to catch the first Igbo graduates were from the late 19th century. That's when they went to Forobe College, Isaac Mba, and so on and so forth. Ifemara, they graduated in the late 19th century. But by the 1920s, when the conquest was now very well established, we started going to school. You understand? We said our first graduate. The first lawyer was in 1935. The first doctor was in 1932, Simon Ong. Salu Mbanefo was in 1935, and various other, the first Igbo engineer, Isaac Iweka from Imperial College. So we started building a new elite because we said, okay, we change, go. So we now change, and then what is quite interesting is this elite, Igbo elite, soon, even though there were still fragmentations, but there was now common cause. So we now started migrating because as the colonials were setting up their infrastructure, the biggest employer of labor in what was Nigeria from 1914 was the railways. A lot of Igbos were joined the railways, and we transited from a subsistence economy to a wage or salary economy. You understand?
Yes.
So by this time, this is where the power is. People started shifting, and they were traveling all over the place. And the thing is, it's natural when you travel to Kafanchan or you go to Kano, where as an employee of the railways, you settle down in an area, you want to hang out with people who are like you.
Like-minded people.
Your own people. That's
your
the
own
language.
people.
So there were these communities, these diasporan communities of Igbo forming at this time. And you could be from Hamufu, you could be from Enugu Ezike, you could be from Olo or Obosi, but
for the fact that you are Igbo, yes.
As was this line from Flavor's song, Ijele, he says, Eba bro, we're dying. You know what I mean? Let's stick together, and we began to stick together. And what happened is that by 1949, this movement, when people like Zik founded his newspaper and actively began to, any Igbo man that comes back after having studied, Zik will run there and publish his picture, to try and instill a sense of pride that look at our son, he's back. And then by 1949, this cluster, the community was blossoming. When Zik came back himself in 1934, my grandfather, Nze Ed Keazor, was one of those who read the welcome speech alongside the Igbo community, because an illustrious Igbo son has come back. Wow. It's not an illustrious Obusi son or illustrious Owerri son. An illustrious Igbo son had come back. So there's that feeling of, because there was a large diaspora. Hey, when we go home, we can quarrel about who owns this land. Obusi and Onitsha will quarrel about who owns Awada, who doesn't own Awada. But when we're in Lagos or when we're in Kano, we're one. So that actually engendered that cohesion. And now let me fast forward. By the time the Igbo Union was founded in 1949, right? The Igbo Union was the overarching cultural body.
Was it political?
It was
strictly social.
It was socio-political, and even economic, because a lot of our interest, a lot of the thinking towards the broad economic projects were ignited, or at least ideated on the platform. It was a progressive platform of Igbo, and
was that what transformed into Ohaneze and Igbo? Was that?
No, Ohaneze was Ohaneze. You would call it Ohaneze. An offspring, in fact, a great-grandchild of the Igbo Union, because there was also Mpoku Igbo, there was also Aki Kenga, and so on and so forth. But Ohaneze became survived the storms, and that also became the last man standing.
Yes.
But let me now talk about the zenith of Igbo cohesion.
Good.
It would have been after the debacle of the Eastern Region crisis of 1953, when Dr. Eyoita was, rather unfortunately, lost his position as premier to Zik, who had lost his bid to win the center and came back and now took over the premiership. It caused a lot of disaffection with our brothers from the EBBO and Cross River Brothers. But then, that aside, the work of consolidating the Eastern region started. Now, the Eastern region didn't just consist of Igbo land. Obviously, as we know, the Cross River people, the Rivers people were part of the Eastern region. But then there was that cohesion. We were within the same geographical area. Now the work started. An incredible amount of developmental work took place. Let's not forget it was the poorest of the three regions at the time.
The Igbo region?
Yes, the Eastern region was the poorest. It was the poorest of the. Let's not.
How so?
It was. Look, you see, there's this.
This was before the Civil War.
Yes, you see, there's this myth that everybody else depended on, we were feeding the rest of the nation. That's not strictly correct. Yes, the northern region at the time of amalgamation was very, very poor. But let's not forget that amalgamation, there was northern and southern protectorate, so there wasn't a subdivision into the east. So for us to know what the east actual output was, But after this, by the end of the Second World War, the North had tin, the North had groundnuts, the North had cotton, which was now the pyramids.
Exported.
Yeah, and then we had palm produce.
Oil, palm oil.
Palm produce. We had palm produce, but so did the West. The West had cocoa, the West had palm produce. So, and the West was far ahead in
Education.
in exports. So we were having to catch up. It's not even hidden, which is why we had leaders then. Zik, for all the bad press he gets, some he may deserve, but the reality is that Zik and a group of Igbo, should I say Eastern leaders of thought, business leaders in particular, felt, look, you know what, let's put our heads down and build this region. That's why I think Igbos should have a debt of gratitude to Sir Louis Ojukwu.
Okay.
No, Sir Louis Ojukwu,
Okay.
because they literally traveled around the world looking for investment opportunities into Igbo land. So that by the time Zik now moved to the center in 1959, after the December 1959 elections, federal elections, when it was clear that there was going to be a coalition between, well, it was clear that he was going to have to move to the center. And then Dr. Michael Okpara now took his place as premier. That was when like a whirlwind of activity took place. 1959 to 1966 was the zenith. You know, and sorry, just to point out, by 1964, a Michigan State University report, which was first published by Professor Anya Okanya, described the Eastern region as the fastest growing economy in the whole world. And the thing is, there was energy. You know, there was energy. We were energized. We were united as a people. There was a sense of pride because there was what?
Cohesion.
Well,
Leadership.
thank you very,
Leadership.
very much. Honestly, we
Absolutely.
wish we had more time. We would have continued
We
this
barely scratched the
conversation.
surface.
I know. I have my own question. I've not even asked the questions I want to ask.
They're telling us that our time is actually
It's fine. So thank you very much for coming into the studio.
It's
to
a
have this
pleasure. It's a
conversation
pleasure.
with
Sorry,
us.
I talk too much.
No, we enjoy,
We enjoyed
your
it,
thoughts.
actually. I think I've learned more from you than I've learned in all my time in secondary school, primary school, and all of that.
Okay,
and
so
in
fun fact,
university.
we're trying to get him an Igbo wife, so
Yeah,
he's an interested party.
I've been to my brother.
No, not yet.
Yeah.
After this, we'll go.
Let them not kidnap
We'll
you.
do-
Not yet, sir, not yet.
So we'll go for entertainment news. We'll see you after this.